Before we begin, there's something I need you to understand. There are places in this world marked on maps as restricted zones. But the real restriction isn't on your body, it's on your perception. Beneath the ground in those places, something is buried. Or more accurately, something is imprisoned. They're not chemical weapons, not nuclear waste, not anything you could look up as a military secret on Wikipedia. They're older. So old that they were already moving across this land long before humans learned to walk upright. The red lines drawn by the military, the barbed wire, the armed patrols. On the surface, they're there to keep people out. But in reality, they're there to keep something in. And our mission that night was to check out a breach in a section of fencing, something that had appeared out of nowhere. November 15th, 1983, Nevada, around 11:40 p.m. My partner, Private First Class Michael Rivera, and I were in an M151 Jeep, running a routine rear area patrol along the Zulu route on the outskirts of the Tonopah test range. They call it the perimeter, but really it's just a godforsaken stretch of desert, scorching enough during the day to turn you into jerky and cold enough at night to crack your bones. The job was mind-numbing. Drive along a fixed dirt road, check the integrity of the fence, make sure no civilian vehicles had wandered in, or more commonly, that no drunk local hunter had chased a jackrabbit into restricted territory. Rivera wasn't himself that night. He was a Mexican-American kid from Texas, easygoing, always talking. But that night he was quiet, constantly rubbing his temples. I asked what was wrong. He said he had a bad headache. Not the usual kind, but something that felt like a buzzing inside his skull. He said it didn't feel like it was coming from outside, more like it was resonating from within his head. I didn't think much of it at the time. Figured he'd just been stuck in the Jeep too long. Later, I realized he'd felt it before I did. Some people's nervous systems are naturally more sensitive to certain frequencies. Rivera was one of those people. He was our early warning system. We just didn't know it yet. At 11:52 p.m., the radio crackled with a transmission from base comms. Call sign Nighthawk Sentinel. We were ordered to proceed to a point about 1 kilometer east of Marker 7 to inspect a section of fence that had reported anomalous activity. The dispatcher's voice sounded off. He paused twice while giving the coordinates, like he was double-checking them. Then he added, "Visual confirmation only. Do not touch. Do not cross the fence line. Report back immediately. Do not touch. Do not cross." That wording is highly unusual for standard patrol procedures. Normally, we're told to investigate and ensure boundary integrity, which means if there's a breach, we get out, inspect it, take photos, patch it temporarily with wire, then report. But that night, the dispatcher explicitly forbade contact. Rivera glanced at me, and there was a look in his eyes I'd rarely seen. Not fear, more like recognition. Like he'd already known something was going to happen, and now it finally had. We drove east along the uneven dirt road. The moon was bright, almost full, but there was a strange haze in the air. Not fog, more like a fine layer of dust suspended midair, scattering the moonlight into a sickly pale yellow. Night vision goggles were useless in it. They just turned the haze into a wash of static. I pushed mine up and used my eyes. The Jeep's engine sounded painfully alone in the desert. Beyond that, there was nothing. This part is important. The Nevada desert is never truly silent. Nighttime is when rattlesnakes, coyotes, owls, and countless rodents are active. Shut off your engine, and you'll hear wind brushing through sagebrush, insects chirping, distant howls. That's the desert breathing, alive. But that night, when we were still about half a kilometer from the site, Rivera suddenly grabbed my arm. "Stop the car," he said. I hit the brakes. The Jeep rolled a short distance before coming to a stop. I was about to ask what was wrong. Then I realized there was nothing. After I killed the engine, we were surrounded by absolute, overwhelming silence. No wind, no insects, no signs of life. That pale yellow haze seemed to absorb sound itself, like the whole world had been sealed inside a giant soundproof chamber. My eardrums felt a strange pressure from the silence, like being underwater. Rivera's breathing grew heavy. His hand was still on my arm, gripping harder than necessary. "You feel that too, right?" he asked quietly. I nodded, but it wasn't just the silence. There was a smell. It's hard to describe. Not a foul odor, not rot, not sulfur, nothing immediately nauseating. It was unfamiliar, out of place, something that didn't belong in that environment. A bit like ozone, the sharp electric smell after a thunderstorm, but thicker, heavier, with a sickly sweet undertone underneath. If I had to compare it, imagine a sealed hospital operating room, an old x-ray machine running at full power, and somewhere in the corner, a bottle of expired cherry cough syrup spilled onto the floor. That mix of metal, ionized air, disinfectant, and artificial sweetness. It didn't just hit your nose, you tasted it deep in your sinuses. Rivera said his headache was getting worse. The buzzing had turned into a high-pitched ringing. He described it like someone had placed a piece of metal in his brain and was grinding it with a dentist drill. I restarted the engine, shifted into low gear, and let the Jeep crawl forward. About 300 meters ahead, I could see the chain-link fence reflecting cold light under the moon. 3 meters high, angled outward at 45 degrees at the top, strung with triple strands of barbed wire. That fence had been standing there since the 1950s. It was the physical boundary between the Nevada test site and the outside world, and a psychological one too. On the other side were buildings that didn't exist on any map, aircraft that vanished from radar screens, the source of decades of rumors and conspiracy theories. And right now, there was a hole in it. Not a clean cut from bolt cutters, not a dent from a vehicle impact. I stopped the Jeep, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out. My boots hit the sand, kicking up a small puff of dust. The smell was stronger now, so strong my throat tightened, every swallow like taking down a mouthful of metallic syrup. I moved around the front of the Jeep and swept the beam across the fence. When the light hit the hole, my hand froze. The metal wires of the chain-link fence weren't bent inward or outward. They had been pulled apart from a central point, as if some immense force had torn them in every direction at once. The ends of each broken wire were melted into strange shapes, like candle wax drips, but solidified into silver-gray metallic beads. There was no rust on the brakes. In fact, they still reflected a damp sheen under the flashlight, as if they had just cooled from extreme heat. The opening was large enough for an adult to walk through upright, and in the sand around it, there were marks. Rivera got out too, carrying an M16, the barrel pointed toward the ground. He came up beside me. The two of us stood there, staring at the marks in the dirt for a long time in silence. They weren't footprints. Footprints are one of the most familiar kinds of traces to humans. Whether it's shoe prints, bare footprints, or the hooves and paw marks of animals, they all follow predictable patterns shaped by biomechanics. The foot makes contact, weight shifts, toes push off, then lift. Every print corresponds to a point of balance. Every set of prints forms a track. That's something you learn in the first week of tracking training. But the marks on the ground had none of those characteristics. They looked like a series of circular depressions, each about 40 to 50 centimeters in diameter, spaced in a highly irregular pattern. In some places, 2 depressions were so close they nearly overlapped. In others, they were more than 2 meters apart. The edges weren't compressed like footprints. They looked more like something had been removed. The finest layer of sand was gone, as if it had been stripped away by a focused suction force, leaving behind shallow pits of coarser grains. There were no signs of pushing or stepping, no directional indicators. The depressions simply appeared there, starting at the breach in the fence, extending out into the desert, and then disappearing behind a patch of low sagebrush. No, not disappearing, ending. The trail stopped abruptly on open sand, with no continuation beyond the final depression, as if whatever had made them had simply lifted off the ground at that point and left the surface entirely. Rivera crouched down and brought his fingers close to the edge of one of the depressions, but didn't touch it. I could see his hand trembling, not from the cold. There was sweat on his forehead. He stood slowly, his gaze following the line of those marks back toward their origin. That direction pointed inside the fence, into the heart of the Tonopah Test Range, toward those low, gray buildings I'd never been allowed to enter, never been told the purpose of. "David," Rivera said, his voice barely above a whisper. The dispatcher said, "Do not make contact." He didn't say, "Don't touch." Do you understand the difference? I did. In military terms, contact has a very specific meaning. It doesn't refer to physical touch. It means initial engagement, the first level of encounter with an unknown entity under rules of engagement. The dispatcher wasn't warning us about the fence. He was warning us not to engage with whatever the target was. That meant they expected something to be there. That meant this wasn't the first time. I should have called in a sitrep immediately. Standard procedure. Visually confirm the anomaly. Report via radio. Then hold position and await further orders. My hand was already reaching for the mic on my shoulder. Then Rivera suddenly snapped his head up, turning toward the northeast. His eyes were wide in the moonlight. Pupils shrunk to pinpoints. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then I felt it. First, the ground. A faint but extremely low-frequency vibration rose through the soles of my boots. Not a horizontal shake like an earthquake, but a vertical, rhythmic pulse. Thump, 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 about 2 seconds apart. Each pulse made the fine grains of sand on the surface jump slightly, as if flicked from below by an invisible hand. I looked down and saw a small pebble in front of my boot twitch twice in place. Then came the sound, or rather, the return of sound after too much silence. The desert's quiet shattered, but not with anything familiar. The sound wasn't something you heard through the air. It felt like it was being generated inside my chest, like someone drawing a bow across my lungs like a cello. A continuous low-frequency hum, below the threshold of normal human hearing. But you could feel it. You could feel your organs vibrating with it. My eyes started to ache. My teeth tingled as if a faint current were passing through them. Finally, the smell. That metallic, sweet, ozone-like odor intensified tenfold. Rivera started gagging, one hand braced against the Jeep's hood, the other still gripping his M16. Tears and mucus ran freely. Not from emotion, just pure physical irritation. My own eyes burned too. Not like cutting onions, but deeper, as if the vitreous fluid inside my eyeballs was being slightly electrolyzed. To the northeast, about 150 meters away, behind a patch of low sagebrush, something was standing up. The first thing I saw wasn't its body, but its shadow cast in the moonlight. The full moon hung behind it, light spilling around its outline, giving it a pale, corpse-like halo. The shadow stretched long, over the sagebrush, across open sand, reaching to within 30 meters of us. It was distorted by uneven ground, but I could make out the top, or what I assumed was the top. It had a geometry I couldn't understand. It wasn't symmetrical. It looked like 3 or 4 extensions growing out in different directions at once. Some upward, some sideways, some bending forward. Each one moved slowly, not like branches swaying in wind, but with deliberate, independent motion. I raised my flashlight and aimed it in that direction. The beam cut across the distance, scattering slightly in the haze, but still illuminating the edge of the brush. Then it moved higher. In that moment, I understood why the dispatcher had said, "Do not make contact." In that moment, I understood Rivera's headache. In that moment, I understood why the desert was so silent, why every living thing had fled. Because they were smarter than we were. They knew what not to approach. Once it stood fully upright, I estimated its height at somewhere between 3.5 to 4 meters. Its central body was disproportionately thick, like a section of an ancient oak trunk, magnified many times over. Its surface wasn't skin, fur, or shell, nothing I recognized as biological. It looked more like a substance caught between solid and liquid, frozen in its current form. The surface had flowing textures, like half-cooled wax or fabric woven from muscle fibers and something else, crumpled and then stretched back out. Under the overlapping light of moon and flashlight, its color was impossible to pin down. It seemed to absorb part of the spectrum while reflecting something outside the normal range. In my report later, I tried describing it as dark brown with a purplish iridescence, but even that felt inadequate. It was more like your eyes were trying, and failing, to assign it a familiar color. extending from that trunk-like body were the appendages I had glimpsed in its shadow. 6 of them. I counted. 6 appendages emerging at different heights and angles. 2 were clearly weight-bearing, planted on the ground, ending in structures similar to the muscular foot of a mollusk, but segmented along the edges like flattened vertebrae. Those 2 appendages were what had left the circular, suction-like depressions in the sand. The other 4 hung in the air, varying in length, the longest extending over 5 meters. Their ends weren't hands, claws, or suction cups, but complex clustered structures, hundreds of hair-thin filaments radiating outward, drifting slowly like the tentacles of a hydra suspended in water. In the flashlight beam, they were nearly transparent. Only at certain angles could you catch the faint, oily sheen reflecting off their surfaces. And those filaments weren't drifting randomly. They were all pointing in the same direction, toward us. That was when Rivera reacted. I'll say this, it was the bravest and the stupidest thing I've ever seen. He raised his M16. Don't! I shouted, but it was too late. Rivera wasn't the kind of person who panicked easily. I've replayed that moment over and over in my head, and I've come to realize he wasn't losing control out of fear. He was trying, using the only method he knew, to regain control of the situation. For a 21-year-old you, Air Force, trained soldier, when you're confronted with something completely outside your frame of understanding, the only thing you can rely on is your training. And his training told him, when faced with a threat, raise your weapon, establish a deterrent posture. This wasn't about firing. It was a warning. It was his instinctive attempt to re-establish order in a moment where all reference points had collapsed. The muzzle of the M16 pointed in the creature's general direction. Rivera didn't flip off the safety. He didn't put his finger on the trigger. He just raised the rifle. Every single filament on that thing froze at the exact same instant. That stillness wasn't the reaction of something startled. It was a system switching modes from passive scanning to active lock. It took me a long time to find the right words for it. Before that moment, those filaments had been scanning, drifting and rotating like radar antennae, gathering environmental data. But the instant Rivera raised his weapon, they all stopped moving, went rigid, and their orientation shifted from roughly pointing in our direction to precisely targeting. Targeting Rivera, the M16 in his hands, the chemical composition of the sweat on his forehead, the waveform of his accelerating heartbeat, the spike of adrenaline in his bloodstream. I have no doubt that in that instant, the thing read everything there was to read about him. Then it moved. The way it moved violated everything I understand about physics. A creature that size, 3.5 meters tall, weighing potentially several tons, should not move like that. It didn't step, didn't crawl, didn't show any visible means of propulsion. It simply displaced. In one frame, it was behind the sagebrush. In the next, it had crossed nearly 40 meters and stood out in the open, fully exposed to the moonlight. No acceleration, no inertia, no sound. Along the path it traveled, the sand surface showed a series of those circular depressions, as if space itself had briefly collapsed along its trajectory. Rivera pulled the trigger. I didn't have time to stop him, didn't even have time to think. The gunshots cracked through the absolute silence of the desert. 3-round burst. The metallic clink of ejected casings sounded unreal in that environment. The M16's muzzle flash flared 3 times in orange bursts against the night. Rivera and I were both solid shots. At that distance, with a target that size, there's no way to miss. But I didn't hear any impact. No dull thud of flesh. No sharp crack of armor. No ricochet. Nothing. 3.5. 56 millimeters rounds just vanished, like they'd been fired into a bottomless body of water and silently absorbed. No, not absorbed. Deflected. Later, when I replayed the moment frame by frame in my mind, I'm certain of what I saw. When the rounds came within about a meter of the creature's surface, the air itself warped visibly, like heat shimmer over asphalt in summer, but more intense, more localized. The trajectories of the bullets bent within that distortion, curving around the creature's body and disappearing into the darkness behind it. Not ballistic drift, not wind, The bullets themselves avoided it. The creature wasn't injured. It didn't even react as if it had been attacked. But Rivera firing, that action itself triggered something. From a recessed area on the front of its body, one I hadn't noticed before, a light emerged. I say light, but it wasn't anything like the light from any source you've ever seen. It wasn't a beam. There was no travel from origin to target. It existed simultaneously where it was emitted and where it arrived. No propagation time. The instant I became aware of it, Rivera's body was already airborne. It was like he'd been struck from the side by an invisible giant hand. His feet left the ground, and he flew sideways about 5 meters, slamming into the side of the Jeep with a heavy metallic thud before collapsing to the ground. The M16 flew from his grip and slid under the vehicle. His helmet went farther, bouncing twice in the sand before coming to rest. He didn't cry out, not once. When he hit the ground, he made no sound at all, just curled in on himself, his body convulsing violently. I ran to him. His eyes were open, but his pupils were vibrating rapidly, like the muscles inside them had lost control. His lips were turning blue, his jaw clenched tight, froth tinged with blood seeping through his teeth. I checked his carotid pulse. It was there, but racing unnaturally fast, like the heart of a bird clutched in your hand. His skin was burning hot. Not a uniform fever, but localized, uneven heat. His chest was the hottest, like something inside it had just discharged energy. I tried to drag him back into the Jeep. I tried to start the engine to get us out of there. But the moment my hand grabbed the strap of his vest, something hit me, something I had never experienced before. It wasn't pain. Pain has boundaries. You can point to where it is, how intense it is. This had no boundaries. It was like every cell in my body was being mildly electrified at the same time, every muscle fiber tightening, every sensory receptor in my skin firing all at once. My vision turned pure white. Not blindness, but overload, like my optic nerve had received a signal it couldn't process and defaulted to white. A high-pitched tone screamed in my ears, constant and piercing, like the whine of an untuned television. My mouth filled with a metallic taste, mixed with the sickly sweetness of something organic being scorched. It lasted maybe 2 or 3 seconds. But in those seconds, I felt something far worse than weakness. Not physical weakness, but existential insignificance. In front of that thing, I wasn't small. I was irrelevant, like a grain of sand in front of a running turbine engine. You don't even create resistance. You're just a meaningless particle, swept away in the airflow. When my vision returned, the creature was no longer where it had been. It had moved above us. Those filaments hung down from above, less than a meter from my face. For the first time, I saw them up close. Each filament was semi-transparent, with faint points of light flowing along its length, shifting slowly between pale blue and amber. The surface wasn't smooth. It was segmented, made up of thousands of microscopic, lens-like structures linked together. As they swayed in front of me, I could feel each movement triggering a faint prickling sensation on my skin, like static discharge, but denser, more rhythmic. It didn't attack me. It hovered there, every filament pointed at Rivera. Later, during psychiatric evaluation, I was asked the same question over and over. How do you know it was looking at Rivera? The psychiatrist had that familiar expression, searching for logical inconsistencies in my account. I gave him the same answer I'll give you. Because it had eyes. Not 2, not many, but they appeared for a moment, then vanished. On the front of its body, just above that recessed area emitting light, its surface reconfigured. That wax-like, semi-fluid material began to flow inward, forming 2 temporary, asymmetrical cavities. The interior of those cavities wasn't that dark brown-purple color anymore. It was absolute black, absorbing all light. Deep inside them, I saw something moving like liquid starlight. It wasn't reflecting external light. It was the light. Then the shape of those cavities adjusted slightly, and a thin, iridescent membrane formed across their inner surface, shifting its curvature as I watched. It was focusing. The moment those 2 cavities adjusted into a specific configuration, I felt something, information, not sound, not images, not language, but a raw, unencoded intent that appeared directly in my mind, bypassing every sensory channel. There were no words, but I understood it completely. It said, or rather, it made me understand, this is wrong. This is defective. This is damaged. It was talking about Rivera. In its frame of reference, Rivera was something damaged because of what he had just done, raising the weapon, firing it. After his nervous system had been pierced by that light, he had become, in its judgment, something unfit, without value, or possibly dangerous. I can't be sure. The only thing I know is that at the exact moment that thought entered my mind, I saw the tips of the filaments hanging over Rivera begin to change. Those microscopic lens-like structures started rotating, adjusting, aligning all the flowing points of light within them toward a single spot on Rivera's head, just above his right ear, about 4 fingers up the parietal region. It was preparing to do something. I didn't know what, but I knew that once it finished, Rivera wouldn't be Rivera anymore. I made the most important gamble of my life. I didn't have a weapon. The M16 was under the Jeep. My sidearm was holstered at my waist, but Rivera's burst had already proven that conventional rounds were useless against this thing. The only thing I had within reach was an M18 smoke grenade clipped to the left side of my vest. It's not an offensive weapon. The M18 is filled with a mixture of hexachlorothane and zinc oxide. Once the fuse burns down, it produces thick gray smoke for concealment and marking. It has almost no destructive power. But I remembered something. Those filament tips, the lens structures, the flowing light, that iridescent membrane adjusting curvature. The way it perceived the world seemed to rely on an extremely precise optical system. Its eyes were temporary constructs, cavities formed from shifting material, combined with adjustable lens membranes. That meant its vision, if you could even call it that, might be vulnerable to interference at certain wavelengths. The smoke from an M18 releases a dense aerosol of hexachlorothane particles, spanning a wide-sized distribution that scatters and absorbs light across visible and near-infrared wavelengths. If I was right, if its sensory system was as precise and fragile as it appeared, then detonating a smoke grenade at close range would be like spraying pepper spray directly into a human retina. I pulled the pin and threw the grenade toward the front of its body. Then I dropped over Rivera, covering the back of my neck with both hands, shutting my eyes, opening my mouth to equalize the pressure. 3 seconds, the longest 3 seconds of my life. When the fuse burned out, I heard a scream, sharp, inhuman. It didn't travel through the air. It detonated inside my skull. It sounded like a massive crystal shattering under a hammer, like 10,000 guitar strings snapping at once, like a frequency you've never heard before, but your nervous system somehow recognizes. Warm liquid flooded my nose instantly. Later I realized it was blood from ruptured capillaries. Then came the heat. An M18 doesn't normally burn hot enough to cause injury. But the instant that creature came into contact with the smoke aerosol, its surface temperature spiked violently in localized areas. My eyes were closed, but I could feel a wave of heat pressing down above me, like an invisible iron hovering inches over my back. The ozone smell in the air became so intense I could barely breathe. Every inhale felt like swallowing a handful of red-hot needles. I opened my eyes. Gray. My entire field of vision was filled with dense, churning gray smoke. Inside it, I saw a massive shape convulsing violently. The filaments that had once drifted slowly were now thrashing like a nest of electrocuted snakes. The lens structures at their tips sparked faintly and continuously when they contacted the aerosol particles, like a short-circuiting circuit board. The creature's entire form began to destabilize. That in-between solid liquid surface rippled, waves spreading from its core through all its appendages. With each wave, its outline blurred further. It started to retreat, not with that instantaneous displacement it used before, but with an awkward, stumbling physical motion. Its 2 supporting appendages struck the ground unevenly, leaving a chaotic trail of depressions of varying depth. Its body flickered in and out within the smoke, like a projection on the verge of shutting down. It moved north, back toward the fence, back toward those low gray structures, back to where it belonged. The smoke began to dissipate. The desert fell quiet again, but not that oppressive, sound-swallowing silence from before. The wind returned. In the distance, the first coyote howl broke through. Insects resumed their chorus from all directions, like an entire ecosystem exhaling at once. The pale yellow haze hanging in the air vanished. Moonlight became clear again, bright and sharp, illuminating the sand, the fence, and the melted-edged breach. The creature was gone. It had withdrawn into the depths of the desert, back beyond the fence, back into the shadows. What remained were those circular depressions leading back to the breach, and a wide patch of sand partially vitrified by intense heat. Sand and gravel fused into dark green, glassy, irregular chunks that crunched like broken glass underfoot. Rivera groaned beneath me. He was still alive. I called for an emergency medevac over the radio. I violated the dispatcher's do not make contact order. I broke at least 5 different protocols on classification and communications because I didn't use any coded language. I went open channel and said it plain. 2 personnel engaged by unknown entity. 1 critically injured. Immediate medical evacuation required. Target is non-human. Repeat, target is non-human. I don't know who was on the other end. I only remember that after I spoke, the radio stayed silent for a long time, long enough that I thought it had died. Then a voice I had never heard before responded, calm to the point of being unsettling. Copy. No questions. No request to repeat. No coordinate confirmation. Just copy. As if they had been waiting for that call. As if all those patrols along the perimeter of the Tonopah test range, the fences, the vague instructions from dispatch, had all been part of something else. Like, on some night, 2 young soldiers who knew nothing would be used as a trigger to confirm something they had always known was there. The medevac helicopters arrived 18 minutes later. 2 of them. One was a UH, one Huey marked with a red cross, landing beside the Jeep. The medics on board loaded Rivera onto a stretcher. His eyes were still open. The trembling in his pupils had stopped, but had been replaced by an expression I had never seen on his face before. Blank, completely hollow. His lips were moving like he was trying to say something, but even leaning in close, I couldn't make it out. One of the medics injected him with something, and his eyelids finally dropped. The second helicopter had no markings. Matte black. No tail number, no insignia. Even the rivets on the fuselage had been painted over. It didn't land. It hovered above the site for about 3 minutes. I could see the side door open, someone inside filming downward with a large lens device. The rotor wash kicked up the vitrified chunks of sand, rolling them across the ground. After 3 minutes, the door closed. The black helicopter turned northeast and flew toward the interior of the test range, toward those low gray buildings I was never allowed to approach. Another Jeep picked me up. The men weren't from my unit. They wore Air Force uniforms, but I'd never seen them before. No unit patches, just the generic insignia of Air Force Systems Command. They told me to get in. We drove in silence. Not back to my post. Instead, deeper into the test range. We passed through 3 armed checkpoints before stopping in front of a single-story concrete building with no windows. I spent about 14 hours in a windowless room inside that building. Someone brought me water and an MRE, but no one spoke to me. The room had a table, 2 chairs, and a fluorescent light overhead. The bulb emitted a constant low hum, the same kind of frequency Rivera had described, like something buzzing inside your head. After 14 hours, a middle-aged man in a major's uniform walked in and sat across from me. He didn't introduce himself, didn't show any credentials, didn't turn on a recorder. He just sat there, looking at me with an expression I had never seen on any human face. There was no hostility in it, no sympathy, no recognizable emotion at all. It was evaluative, like a machine scanning an object, determining whether it was acceptable, whether it should be returned or destroyed. He looked at me for 15 seconds. Then he said it. Corporal Hawkins, you didn't see anything in the desert last night. I didn't respond. He continued. He said Rivera would be transferred within 24 hours to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas. Diagnosis: severe electromagnetic radiation exposure from accidental contact with decommissioned radar equipment during training. Prognosis: good, though there might be minor, permanent memory irregularities. He said we had reported a damaged fence during patrol, and while repairing it, Rivera had accidentally touched an unmarked abandoned cable and suffered an electric shock. While assisting him, I had inhaled fumes from the cable's burned insulation, resulting in temporary disorientation and hallucinations. That was the only official version of events. He said my service record was solid. He didn't want to see my career affected by this incident. He mentioned my family, not as a threat, just casually. So they had my mother's address in Ohio. If necessary, they could arrange a transfer for me closer to home. Then he stood up to leave. When he reached the door, I finally spoke. "That thing," I said. "It went back, but it's still there, isn't it?" His hand was already on the doorknob. He didn't turn around. "Has it come out before?" Silence. "Will it come out again?" He turned the handle and opened the door. Light from the hallway spilled in, forming a rectangle across the floor. He stepped halfway out, then paused. I thought he might answer. He didn't. He just tilted his head slightly and gave me one last look, that same expression. Then the door closed behind him, the latch clicking into place. I never saw that major again. I never saw Rivera again. After I got out of the hospital, I tried to find him. I called his unit, the one he belonged to before the transfer. The person who answered told me Private First Class Michael Rivera had been removed from the active roster. Medical discharge. No forwarding address. No contact information. His service record just ended, like a river running into the desert and vanishing. I reached out to veterans' offices in Texas. Nothing. No follow-up records. No trace. It was like he had been erased from the world. The only proof he had ever existed sat in that M151 Jeep with me that night, rubbing his temples and saying something's buzzing inside my head was my memory. I stayed in the service 4 more years after that, discharged in 1987 as a sergeant. I was never assigned anywhere near a test range again. The rest of my time was stateside, clerical work at Wright-Patterson in Ohio, then logistics at Langley in Virginia. Quiet, ordinary, like a cup of coffee gone cold. No creatures, no breaches and fences. No one ever mentioned that night in Nevada again. Like those 14 hours, that major's stare, Rivera's hollow face on the stretcher. It had all been a dream I'd had alone. But I know it wasn't, because even now, whenever I'm somewhere quiet enough, alone at home late at night, or out camping when the wind suddenly dies, I can still smell it. Ozone, metal, expired cherry cough syrup. It rises up from memory, filling my nose and throat, making my eyes ache. And every time it happens, the back of my neck prickles like something incredibly fine is brushing against my skin, scanning, reading, confirming, as if checking whether I'm still intact. I've kept silent for over 40 years. Not because of the major's implied warning. Not because of classification agreements. The paperwork I signed wouldn't hold up under real scrutiny anyway. I stayed silent because I didn't know how to begin. How do you explain to your wife that the smell that wakes you up at night isn't a gas leak? How do you tell your friends from after the service that you don't go camping not because you hate bugs, but because you're afraid of seeing something stand up in the distance when the desert goes silent? How do you describe something that fundamentally doesn't belong to human experience, using a language built entirely for human experience? But now they're saying the files will be declassified. April 2026. I've seen the hearing clips on the news. I've seen the expressions on those officials' faces when they're asked about non-human biological samples. That's not concealment. That's fear. That's the look of someone holding the key to Pandora's box when someone asks what's inside. They know. They've always known. They just don't know what happens if the box is opened. I've also seen fragments of those so-called declassified documents circulating online. Most of it is garbage. Decades of misinformation and conspiracy theories piled up. But some of it, when I saw it, every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. There was an internal memo dated 1984 discussing perimeter security upgrades at Tonopah Test Range. It mentioned something I recognized instantly: unexplained molten breaches in fencing. And in that memo, they used a code name to refer to the potential source of those breaches. That code name was Harvester, not visitor, not observer, not anything neutral, not anything that suggested scientific curiosity. Harvester. For 40 years, I've replayed every detail of that night, trying to understand the intent it projected at the very end. This is wrong. This is defective. This is damaged. It was evaluating Rivera. In that instant of contact with the light, it read everything. His physiology, his neural responses, the structure of his consciousness, and made a judgment. This individual did not meet some standard. This individual was damaged. But what is the standard? And what does damage mean? If Rivera was only deemed damaged because of the impact of that light, then was he already within its perceptual range before he even raised the M16? Before he clutched his head and said, "Something's buzzing inside my skull." Those filament tips, the lens-like structures, the drifting tendrils scanning the environment. Were they always watching? Always collecting? Always evaluating every living thing that approached that fence? It retreated. The dense aerosol from the M18 interfered with its optical system, forcing it to interrupt whatever process it had begun and withdraw beyond the fence. But it wasn't injured, something that could deflect 56 rounds doesn't get hurt by smoke. Its retreat felt more like a system reset, an invalid input forcing it into a default state. Not escape, suspension, standby, which means it, or they, are still there. What's beneath the Tonopah test range, I don't know. The rumors, wreckage from Roswell, agreements with non-human entities, reverse-engineered craft, multi-level underground facilities. I can't separate truth from fiction. But I know what I saw that night was not a product of human technology. Its movement, its material form, its ability to communicate directly with my mind. They all point to a conclusion that still unsettles me. Our definition of life is laughably narrow. We think life requires carbon and water. We think it's bound by Darwinian evolution. We think intelligence peaks with language and tools. We think we're the only species on this planet that looks at the stars and asks what's out there. But what if, just what if, before we learned to control fire, before the last Neanderthal's campfire died out in a European cave, before the earliest trilobites crawled through Cambrian seas, there were already things here. Not visitors, not invaders, natives, older natives, sharing this land with us the whole time, just beyond our perception, like ants unable to perceive the aircraft passing overhead. We build cities, draw borders, wage wars, declassify files, and in the blind spots of our awareness, they continue doing whatever it is they've always done. Harvester, that code name from Memo. If it harvests, what does it harvest? And what did Rivera's damage really mean? What would have happened if it had finished what it started? Would he have become an empty shell? Or would he have been repaired into something that met its standard? For 40 years, I've dreamed that moment. The filaments aligning over his parietal lobe, the lens structures rotating, focusing, preparing. Every time I wake from that dream, I find myself touching the spot above my right ear. Sometimes the skin there tingles for no reason. April 2026. They say this time it's real, full declassification. Congress has passed the legislation. The Pentagon has been ordered to release all materials related to UAPs and non-human biological samples before the deadline. The internet is already exploding with speculation. Blurry photos, radar data, pilot testimonies, or another Roswell, where at the last second, executive privilege steps in and all we get are pages blacked out. I don't need those files to confirm what I experienced was real. My body remembers. My nose remembers. The skin at the back of my neck remembers. But I need them for something else, to find out how much they know. That major, the one who looked at me like that for 15 seconds, how long had his system been dealing with the harvester before November 15th, 1983? Those gray buildings behind the fence, were they built to study it or to feed it? The craft that appear over the range and vanish from radar, are they reverse engineered from it? Or do they belong to it? And Rivera, Private First Class Michael Rivera, Texas, 21. He used to hum songs by Los Lobos on patrol. When his head hurt, he'd press his fingers into his temples. After that night, he disappeared. If there's any record any line, any code that points to his name or what became of him, I'd fly to Washington myself, sit in the National Archives, and turn that page with my own hands. Not for justice, not for accountability. Those words are too small for something like this. I just want to know where he went after it decided he was damaged. I just want to know what a complete human looks like to it. It's late. This recording is probably enough. I'm sitting in the basement of my house in Ohio. Outside, it's raining, April rain. I bought this place after I got out with what I'd saved during my service. The lawn needs mowing. The gutters need clearing. Tomorrow morning, I'll make a cup of coffee, drive into town, pick up a bag of grass seed, come back, and take care of those things one by one. Life goes on. The sun rises like it always does. Spring in Ohio feels like it does anywhere else. Ordinary, calm, unquestioned. But sometimes, late at night, after the rain stops, when the air gets quiet enough, I turn off the basement lights, sit in the dark, close my eyes, and wait. Wait for that smell to rise up from memory. Ozone, metal, expired cherry cough syrup. Wait for that faint, needle-like sensation on the back of my neck. It's still checking. 40 years later, it hasn't stopped. And I still don't know what it's checking for. Whether I've become damaged like Rivera, or whether that night, in the chaos of smoke and interference, it left something in me. And now it just comes back, periodically, to inspect its sample. April 2026. Will the declassified files give us answers? Or just more questions we never thought to ask? That door is opening. I don't know what's behind it, but I do know this. On November 15th, 1983, in the Nevada desert, through the smoke, I saw something stand under the moon. Something that doesn't belong to our time, maybe not even to our understanding of this planet, or maybe belongs to it so completely that we refuse to admit it. It never left. It just went back beyond the fence. And now, someone is getting ready to tear that fence down. Are you ready?